Alright, let's talk about some simple rules of composition. These are rules that work for fine art, they work for illustration, perhaps they work for graphic design, photography. I teach them to my beginning students, I teach them to my illustration students. They work from beginners all the way to the advanced levels, and they are things that I think about when I'm composing my pictures. Here's just about the most important rule, which is why it is number 1. Let's say I have two compositions. Here's composition 1, and here I have a little vase that looks like this, sitting on a table, and here's a lemon. What's the problem with this composition? It has a very poor balance between positive and negative space. What is negative space? Negative space is the space that is not the objects, the space around the objects, the background. What is positive space? The objects, the table, the lemon, the vase. What is a better compositional option? Well, a zoomed in shot. So here's our table. Let's say it's going back this way, like this, and then I'm going to place the vase a little bit closer to my eye and place the lemon here. This is a better balance of positive and negative space. Now, what is the ideal balance? Is it 30-70? Is it 60-40? Is it 65-35? If I've done my math correctly. The answer is, it's not entirely clear. Definitely not 20% positive space, 80% negative space. That's clearly off. But, you know, anything between, let's say, 40-50%, perfectly fine. So, rule number 1 is to balance positive and negative space. Balance positive and negative space. Rule number 2. Let's say I have a composition that looks like this. Here's a table. Now, I've done an excellent job of balancing positive and negative space here. Here's my vase. But now I'm going to take my lemon and put it right here. This is an example of centering. The composition is lined up exactly in the middle of my picture. A better composition would look like this. Here's my vase, and then my lemon's over here, like this. This is an off-balance composition. Now, why is it better? Well, a composition needs to accomplish two things. It needs to move the eye, and it needs to unify. An off-balance composition moves the eye more effectively. When things are off balance, it creates movement. It forces the eye to go from one spot to another spot to another spot. When a composition is centered, the eye moves to the clump in the middle and refuses to go anywhere else. So, off-balance your composition, they create more movement, and the more movement you get, generally speaking, not always the case, the better your composition. So, rule number 2, I'm going to place it here, is to avoid balancing. Avoid balancing, centering, and alignment. Now, we've already covered centering. What is balancing? What is alignment? Well, balancing is very similar to centering. It's a form of centering. It's when, let's use a horizontal format, you place two objects of equal visual weight on each side of the composition. So, what is the centering part of it? Well, you've got nothing in the center. So, in effect, it's centered. Balanced compositions tend to also be static, but most importantly, they create disunity. They create two equal areas of focus which split the composition into two parts. So, not only is it static, it prevents the eye from moving around, it also disunifies, creates disunity in the composition, and violates the second purpose of composition, which is to unify, which is to bring things together as opposed to splitting them apart. So, this is balancing. Don't do it. What is a better version of this composition? Well, when things are, again, off-balanced, where you have a little bit more weight visually on one side than the other. This is okay. It's not great, but it's better. This is an off-balance composition. So off-center composition, off-balance composition. What is aligning? Well, aligning is when you line everything up along the same horizontal axis. So here's a vase, and then here's the bowl, and then here's the lemon. Everything is aligned along the same horizontal line. That's called alignment. Avoid balancing, avoid alignment. Now, a corollary of avoid balancing, centering, alignment is to distribute your objects in space. Meaning, if I have one object that is far away, one object that's a little bit closer, and another object, let's say a bowl, somewhere in between, it generally creates a better composition than if you clump everything together, if you center, if you balance, if you align. Distribute your objects in space. Again, this applies not only to still life, but also to landscape. So as an example, when you're doing a landscape, quite often you'll find successful compositions have something in the foreground, a branch, something in the middle ground, maybe some kind of pond with some bushes, and I don't know why that tree is coming out of the pond, but all right. And something in the foreground, some kind of trees, maybe mountains. I'm distributing my objects, so I've got a foreground, middle ground, and some kind of background. Right? So applies to still life, applies to landscape just as well. Distribute your objects in space. Okay, so those are the first two rules. Balance positive negative space, avoid balancing, centering, alignment, distribute your objects. All right, let's talk about rule number 4, which is incredibly important. Rule number 4. Avoid tangents. What are tangents in visual arts? Here's an example. Let's say I have a table. Here's the front of the table. Here's the back of the table, going this way. Let's say I have an apple in the foreground that looks like this. And let's say further back, I have another apple that looks like this. These apples are at different distances, but because their contours line up, it creates a tangent and visually glues them together. It makes them look like they're touching each other. So a tangent is an awkward alignment of objects at different distances. How do you fix this particular tangent? You have one or two options. Either you can move one apple away from each other, do something like this, or this is often the better option, show a clear overlap. Right? Show one apple overlapping another apple. There's many different kinds of tangents. You can have tangents between objects at different depths, like these two apples, or here's another example of a tangent. Let's say I have an apple and I've drawn the top of the apple as if it's perfectly aligned with the back of the table. That's another tangent. The solution is always going to be one of two things. Either I move the apple down, so I move it down a little bit this way, or I move it up so that it clearly overlaps the table. Guys, in a complicated composition, tangents can happen a lot in lots of different circumstances, especially in multiple figure composition. If we have a lot of overlapping figures at different depths, you want to make sure that you don't have an awkward elbow hitting a forehead. So as an example, let's say we have a landscape where there is a tree in the background, like this. And then we have somebody here running in the foreground. like this, right? This tangent creates the impression that his forehead is hitting the wall, like this, right? Or let's say there's some kind of boulder here that gives the impression that he's about to bump his knee. Let's say that there's a person sitting right here in the grass, like this. That gives the impression that he's carrying a little miniature person on his shoulders, on his back. Hopefully that makes sense. Avoid tangents. Now, there are two broad categories of tangents. There are tangents between objects at different depths. There are also tangents between objects and the edge of the picture. So here is another version of a tangent. Let's say we have a table that's running off the picture, like this. And then let's say back here we have another apple going this way. The apple touching the edge of the picture is a tangent. The way to fix it, one of two options. Either move it away, like this, move it this way, or nothing wrong with having objects leave the picture, so long as you're clear about the fact that there's something outside of the frame. So, tangents between objects at different distances, and then tangents between objects and the edge of the picture. Please avoid both kinds of tangents. All right. Rule number 5. This is a rule that's easier to simply illustrate than to describe verbally. Imagine I have two landscapes. Here's option A, here's option B. Both have the same exact subject matter. In this one we have a horizon line. Let's say in the foreground we have a road, a house, a couple of windows, a chimney, a door. Here we have a tree. Happy little sun, a cloud. And then here we have some kind of car. 86 Volvo DL, one of my favorites. It's kind of boxy. Okay, that's composition number one. Let's say we have some kind of guy here as well. Here's composition number 2. We've got the same horizon, except now the road does this. The house does this. Our car does something like this. And then our tree, where should I put the tree? Let's do this. Is doing this, and then our guy is doing the 100-yard sprint because ex-wife is in the car. Okay, question for you guys. Oh, I forgot the sun. Which composition is better? In every single class I've taught over the last, 17 years, it's been 15 years, the answer has always been B. Sometimes you get a joker that will argue A, but it's usually B. And the question is, why? And most students will start saying, well, it has more depth, it has more perspective. Ultimately, they arrive on the fact that this composition has more movement. Why does it have more movement? Why? Because it has a lot of strong diagonals. Diagonals suggest movement. The more diagonals you include in the composition, the more you force the eye to move around the composition. So, the opposite of that is a composition with lots of very, very long, stiff, static, horizontal, and vertical lines. I think this has something to do with our instinct for movement. If, let's say, we're at the Stonehenge and we see a post and lintel structure that looks like this, we would be perfectly comfortable standing underneath. However, if you see a structure that's starting to look like this, you'd probably hesitate. You would run away, right? So diagonals suggest that something is about to fall or something is about to run. It gives the impression of movement. So this composition is more dynamic because it has more diagonals. This composition is very static because it's full of incredibly stable, perfectly vertical and perfectly horizontal lines. So the rule here is that you need to avoid long horizontals and verticals and try to include diagonals. So let's shorten the rule to number 5. Include diagonals. Include diagonals. Very important aspect of composition in order to create movement. Again, composition needs to do two things. It needs to unify and needs to move the eye. The more the eye moves from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, the better the composition. The more verticals or horizontals you include, the more static the composition is. Now, there are always exceptions to all of these rules. The point is to learn the rules and understand what happens when you violate them. What happens when you violate the rule of positive negative space? Well, it gives a very quiet, sad feeling to the piece. What happens when you create tangents? It creates visual confusion, awkwardness, discomfort. What happens when you balance? It makes compositions very, very static. Sometimes you want a static composition. What's an example of a static composition? Well, religious iconography, right? Some kind of saint. The composition is perfectly balanced, it's perfectly static, quite often it's triangular, which is also very, very stable. This is done for the concept. Right? The concept here is, I am God, I was, I am, I will be, you better behave. I'm not going anywhere. So, learn these rules, understand what happens when they're violated, and then feel free to break them, because quite often that's a really common strategy in modern art, contemporary art, right? Artists messing with these rules, messing with your expectations of what a composition needs to be. Okay, that's it for now. I'm going to put a second tutorial where we're going to talk about not the formal, these are the formal rules of composition, but the conceptual rules of composition. That's coming up.